Hello. Welcome to the UK Forestry webinar series. We're excited to have you all with us tonight. If this is your first time attending one of these, welcome aboard. And if you've been with us for a while, we're glad to have you back. Before we turn the presentation over to Chris Will, a couple of quick housekeeping items. Now, if you're watching this as a recording, these pods will not be available, but for you tonight, they are available. So if you look in the upper left-hand corner, there's a pod that's called Files, and in that are a number of files that you can download. If you're at a county extension office, most likely your agents have already printed these all for you and have passed them out. If you happen to be watching from home, you can download those for your own use at home, so please take advantage of those. I will say that if we do have master loggers at county extension offices and you need continuing education credit, please make sure you fill out the KML CEU form and turn that in to your county extension agent to get credit. There is also an evaluation amongst those files. Please take a few minutes at the end of the program to complete that evaluation. Let us know how we did and what we can do better. And turn that into your county agent and they'll get it to us. One other file I want to point out to you is the timber sales packet file. In that file, Chris has put together a few slides that will help cover some of the stuff he's going to be talking about, so those are available to you as well. So with that said, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. I will mention, before that, the chat pod in the lower left-hand corner, that's how we're going to handle questions. So if you've got questions, please just put them in the chat pod and we'll get to them. Okay, so now let's turn it over and get with Chris Will. Chris, so glad to have you with us tonight. Thank you so much. Chris is a consultant forester from Central Kentucky Forest Management. And Chris, we are so delighted to have you with us. This is an important topic for landowners, certainly, selling their timber.
Well, yes, it is, Billy. Again, thank you for inviting me here tonight and allowing me to share what I know about timber sales. It is one of the most common questions that we receive. People want to know what's the best way to sell their timber.
Yeah, and I'll tell you, Chris, it's often the question I get, and so many times I'll get that question after the timber sale's taken place, and so we're so excited to try to get ahead of that for folks so they can get that information. Chris is here tonight representing the Kentucky Association of Consultant Foresters. He'll tell you a little bit more about that, but Chris, again, we thank you so much for being a part of this program and sharing your expertise, and I know everybody's going to get a lot out of it tonight.
Well, thank you, Billy. I'm glad to be here.
Okay. Excellent. So, Renee, we can go ahead and get started with the presentation.
Okay. Well, I want to welcome everyone here. I'm glad that you're interested in the subject of timber harvesting, and we're going to start the presentation with a little bit of background. I am a consulting forester, and there are many different types of foresters that are out there. Some industrial foresters, some involved in research, some that work for the state. But I'm a consulting forester, and as a consulting forester, I feel it's important that I'm part of an organization called the Association of Consulting Foresters. And as a ACF forester, I use the initials ACF after my name. I perform several different functions or services for private landowners: timber sale administration, forest management plans, forest assessments, forest inventories, and a variety of other subjects. Now, an ACF forester is a privately employed businessman or woman that provides forestry services to woodland owners for a fee. And what our credentials mean is that through ACF, we have an accreditation. We have a minimum of a Bachelor's of Science degree in forestry, and that comes from an accredited university, and a minimum of 5 years of forest management experience, and a code of ethics. And that ethics, those code of ethics come along with a ethics review board, and we have a continuing education requirement. So it's important we separate ourselves from others in the fact that we have this accreditation from ACF. Now, Billy mentioned that there is a web link to the KACF website, and that's a pretty handy tool that you can use to locate consulting foresters in your area. There's a directory on the website, and there's also a map that will help you locate a forester near you. So the website is available, but also I believe there are some brochures available for download. And if you go to the KACF_brochure, that contains a lot of the same similar information. So let's get started about specifically about timber sales and what one needs to know if they're interested in selling timber. Very often what happens is that I'll receive a phone call and somebody has either acquired some timberland, maybe through inheritance, or they purchased a tract of land. Perhaps sometimes it's been in the family for a long period of time, but now they're starting to consider the options of harvesting timber. And they ask, where do I start? Well, the first thing you need to do is have, if you're talking with a consulting forester or seeking out help to sell your timber, you need to share some information with that forester. You need to know what you have in terms of timber. What's the forest resource like? What also is very important are boundary lines. This is an issue that can cause a lot of grief if it's not pursued in advance of the timber sale. So we'll talk about identifying your boundary lines and the importance associated with that. I want to mention that you need to consider your tax implications, and when you're selling timber, you're going to be bringing some money in. You want to try to keep as much of that in your pocket as possible, and pay only the taxes that you need. So we'll cover that subject as well. And one of the things I want to reflect on is if we're planning ahead, we need to really kind of define our objectives, and so we'll talk a little bit more about what that means as we go through this presentation. When you start out, somehow you have to, the forester needs to know how much timber you have out there. And when we say know your timber resource, sometimes what happens is the forester will come out and give you a quick assessment of what you have. It may be included in just a walk through the woods, some discussion of what you have, and taking a look at the resource and trying to decide the size of the timber. Is it large enough? Is it merchantable timber? Is it something that can that the forester can put together in a successful sale? Timber volumes, the total volume of the sale and the volume per acre. Those are important when you're putting together a timber sale. So that information is going to be important to the forester. We want to know something about the species composition. Some of our species in the state of Kentucky are quite valuable. White oak and walnut are very valuable species, but we've got ready markets for hickory, yellow poplar, red oak, and so we want to have some idea of what that species composition is going to be like. Of course, timber quality is important. Higher quality timber is valued at a higher price and is often pursued with a lot of competition, which can be good in a timber sale. Access to the timber. How hard is it to get the timber out? And that's important. The topography, how steep the ground is. Once the trees are felled and skidded to a landing, is that landing in close proximity to a highway? What are the conditions for getting that timber to market? We're going to assess that when we walk through the woods. So we also want to know about any limitations or special conditions, and these things can vary. So you need to share this information with the forester, and in a walk through the woods and a timber assessment, a lot of this information can be exchanged. Now I want to stress something that many people when they give us a call, they're kind of eager to get started with the timber sale process. But I always take them back to the boundary lines and say, let's discuss how well we know our boundary lines. It's really important to have a map and have your boundaries well marked in advance of a timber sale so that we can prevent a timber trespass. And the question often comes to me, do I need to have my property surveyed? Not always. It kind of depends on the situation. Do we have some old fences? Do we have some documentation? Do we have a good relationship with the adjoining landowners? And I often ask, are there any disputed boundary lines? So we're going to ask those questions as we go through the timber assessment. I think it's important that you understand the timber trespass law and your part in that. What is your liability in timber trespass? We're going to talk a little bit about how a landowner shares the responsibility with the logger and the forester to make sure that we're harvesting timber only on the property of the landowner. And I always state, notify your adjoining landowners in advance of harvest. This is important. The timber trespass law states in there that advance notification is voluntary, but this is going to resolve a lot of issues, whether they're known or unknown, in advance of harvesting timber. And ultimately, we don't want to get into a timber trespass situation. Resolve those property line disputes in advance. Get it done before we start harvesting timber. So, as a property landowner, you really need to take the responsibility to know where your boundary lines are. Conducting a timber harvest, if a timber trespass occurs during a timber harvest, the logger, the landowner, and the forester can all be held liable for the mistake. Let's just go ahead and find and mark those boundary lines first. Now, we talked a little bit about taxes and how that is a factor in planning and deciding when to harvest your timber. So, in general, the timber investment or the timber tax rates for timber sales are favorable to landowners, but there's a few things that you need to know. In general, the capital timber investments are treated as capital gains, and so the tax rate for capital gain is taxed at a lower rate than the ordinary income rate. So that's a good thing. We want capital gains treatment of our timber revenue. But we do want to hold that resource, what we call a long-term capital gain. We want to hold that asset for at least 12 months after we either inherit it or purchase it, so that we can take advantage of the capital gains treatment for the income. We're going to talk just briefly about timber basis. There's a great part to the timber income tax law that says that upon inheriting property, you can step up your basis in timber to the value of the timber at the date of death. So if you think about timber basis this way, the higher your basis, the higher the value of that timber, the lower your capital gain, and the lower your capital gain, the less tax you have to pay. So by updating that timber basis to the date of death, the day in which you inherit the property, that's a huge tax advantage for anybody selling timber. Now, what I suggest is consult your accountant first. As we get into the process and we start talking about the details of having a timber sale, consult your accountant and let them know. We're going to share with you approximately how much money the timber sale may be worth, and you can share that information with your accountant. He can look at your specific set of circumstances and make good, sound decisions or information. He can share that with you as you go through the timber sale process. Now, I would like to bring your attention to the web links that are listed in the side panel. The National Timber Tax website is a great resource for both you, the landowner, and your accountant. So if you get a chance, visit the National Timber Tax website, click on the link, and spend a few minutes there. They've got a great website there. It's well organized, and you may not be able to understand all the information there, but you'll get a good idea of what questions to ask your accountant or your forester as you start to plan your timber sale. Now, I'm going to finish up this section with what I call defining your management objectives. So you own a piece of timberland and you're considering a timber harvest. One of the things you want to do is start to think out in the future. If you're going to harvest timber, you want to think about the next stand of timber that's going to grow in its place. Very often, we suggest that a landowner, if given enough time, should have a management plan written in advance of the timber sale. And if you do plan a timber harvest and you have a management plan, let's make sure that it coincides with the objectives that you stated in that management plan, or perhaps maybe what you want to do is update that management plan to reflect your timber sale plans. So I think the point here is that a management plan is a very valuable tool for planning out into the future, and it should be tied to your timber harvesting plans. Very often we offer the service of management plan writing, and we do that for the landowner in advance of a timber sale. So really something to consider. The picture in this slide right here is actually some what we call advanced reproduction. This is a red oak seedling in a timber stand, and our plan is to harvest this tract in about 10 to 15 years. And what we want to do is we want to develop and nurture this advanced regeneration before we harvest. So this is part of the planning process, and you should consider that when laying out your timber plan sales. I'm going to also suggest that you understand basic silvicultural principles of hardwood forests. That sounds like a mouthful, but what it basically means is, how does the hardwood forest develop? How does it grow? How does it regenerate? I've got a great article listed over there on the side panel, or actually for download. It's called Big Trees, and I believe it's also available in your packet if you're joining us through one of the extension offices. But Big Trees, Little Trees. It's a simple article. It's brief, but it's got a lot of good information on how the development of a hardwood forest takes place. So I urge you to read that. It's got some great information in it. And this is going to be part of your education. It's going to help you answer some of the questions about how we replant the forest after we harvest it. And we're going to rely on Mother Nature for the most part to get that done. Well, now I think we're ready to talk about the timber sale process. And I've got a flow chart here. Again, this is part of your packet, so you can, if you want to turn to it in your packet and look at it, we're going to break down the timber sale process into several different steps. I use this flow chart with my clients, and this flow chart kind of breaks down the process into smaller pieces so you can understand what's going on. And I always start out with the initial meeting. The initial meeting could be the same thing as that timber assessment that I was talking about. What we're looking at is we're going to discuss your objectives and your ownership plans. We're going to walk through the woods with the forester to assess the timber resources. And we're going to share management plans and maps and survey plats so that we have all the information we need to get started in a timber sale. So that initial meeting is pretty much the timber assessment that I talked about earlier. Well, once we kind of decide that we have a timber resource that's large enough, has merchantable timber, we have access, we can get the timber out, we've answered all the basic questions. Now we want to think about the measurement of the timber to be sold. If you're selling something, anything, you've got to take some measures to figure out what you're selling, what the value of it is, and who may be the interested buyers. So the timber measurement step is very crucial, and this is where a consulting forester can be very helpful to you. What you have is several different types of measurement or inventory that can take place to help you determine what the volume is. Timber volumes can be determined by sampling or what we refer to as a 100% inventory. Usually, a 100% inventory includes marking the sale trees with timber marking paint as we go through the process. We're measuring the trees, we're painting the trees to be sold, we're putting a mark on the tree at about eye level, and then we're putting another mark at the base of the tree. We call this a below stump mark, so when the tree is cut, the mark stump remains, and we can ensure that the trees that we put up for sale are the ones that are cut. Now, we could also take a different approach to the measurements. We could use a sale unit, and we could flag off 15, 20, 35 acres, whatever the prescription is for the timber sale, whatever we decide is the area that needs to be harvested and regenerated. We're going to flag that area off, and we're going to estimate the timber volume using sampling techniques. So we're not going to measure every tree, but we're going to make samples distributed evenly throughout the forest, and we're going to come up with a timber volume based upon these samplings. It's very accurate. It's scientifically proven that it works as long as you, the forester, are well practiced at it and you follow all the procedures appropriately. Now is a good time to make sure your adjoining landowners know that you're planning a timber harvest. We do this for our clients when we offer timber sale administration as part of our timber marking process. We are going to notify the adjoining landowners by certified mail, return receipt requested. And that's how it is outlined in the voluntary law that states that you should notify your adjoining landowners in advance of sale, and we do that through a letter, and generally we include a map, and this will alert the adjoining landowners to our intent to harvest timber, and also what it'll do is if there's any concerns or disputes, it's going to bring them forward before we actually harvest the timber. So this is a good time to notify your adjoining landowners. Now, from those measurements, what we need to do is generate a report. We need to convey the information, the measurements that we made, into a useful report, what we call a timber sale prospectus. And I've got an example of one. You also have this in your packet, or you can download it. And this document right here is what we are referring to as the timber prospectus. And this has some great information in it for the landowner initially. We did this particular one for landowners John and Jane Doe over in Casey County, and they have a 200-acre farm and 30 acres is contained in the timber sale that we're selling here today. So we went out, we measured each of the trees, and we've listed them here by both product, so these are different products, and species. So you have a list of white oak, and that's underneath the veneer category, and we have some northern red oak in that category, and we have some walnut and some cherry. So if you look at the subtotals for the veneer logs, we have 94 trees. That's the first column. And we have 33,000 board feet. Now if we zoom all the way down to the bottom, well, let's take a look at this. We've got a category called what we call grade saw timber, hardwood grade saw timber. And that contains more species and more volume. There's over 400 trees in that category and 120,000 board feet. And they're all listed out here in the side by species, number, and volume. And then we have some what we call smaller, lower grade trees. These are trees that would not manufacture high quality grade lumber, but could be used for products such as railroad ties or pallets, where the appearance of the lumber is not as important as the structural integrity of that wood. So we've got those listed as well, and there's about 60 trees, 57 trees, and 9,000 feet of that material listed as well. So if we go to the bottom, we've got our grand totals. The number of trees, 169,500 board feet, included in this sale. And remember, each one of these trees are marked with paint at eye level, and then again at stump level. And that's what I'm indicating with the pointer. Now, in this particular sale, we have a high percentage of white oak veneer logs. So in Kentucky, we're very fortunate that we grow some high quality white oak, and as part of this timber prospectus, we want to promote that to potential buyers. In this case, we did something a little extra special. Each one of the trees that we felt was had a veneer quality log in it, we identified it with a number, and we ran a second tally that gave much more detail about that white oak veneer than just the total volume. Okay, and so this allows the prospective buyers to go out and inspect those trees and pull out a very specific tally. Now, I don't have that tally with me today, but this is a nice breakdown of material by potential products, and those products are associated with prices and values. So it's important to come up with a good inventory of what you're selling. Now, I'm going to bring your attention to the final two columns, okay? So I always say that this particular sheet right here is for the landowner's eyes only. And what I've done is I have calculated values associated with each one of these products and species. And over on the final column, we assign prices, and that says dollars per thousand board feet, MBF. MBF is an abbreviation for thousand board feet. And dollars per thousand board feet is customarily how buyers and sellers of timber talk about the values of timber. Well, we use these prices, and we come up with a total, and now we have a fair estimate, $44,590 of what that timber is worth. Now, this is important because at this point, what we want to be able to ensure is that the landowner is interested in selling their timber at the appraised value. So I always say to the landowner, you know, we've given you a ballpark figure as we did the assessment, but now we have an inventory with a very firm number. We believe on the day that we sell this timber, if we do it in a sealed bid or negotiated sale, we feel we're going to obtain a price equal to or greater than this appraised price. So now we've kind of set everything into perspective. We're not guessing what's going to happen on the day of the bid opening. We've got a firm idea of what that timber is worth. Now, I always say that if the landowner is uncomfortable with that amount or doesn't feel he wants to sell the timber for that amount, well, you know, this is a good time to sit down and discuss that with the forester, and perhaps we won't bring that one to sale, but perhaps they'll just pay us for the inventory work that we've done up to that point. Okay, well, the landowner's happy with the dollar amount, is ready to sell, and so now, if we're going to take a sealed bid approach to selling this timber, we've got some work to do. The consulting forester needs to market the timber. Now, contrary to what most people believe, timber does not sell itself. If you have a good track, it's high quality, and it's easy to get out, those are all very attractive features. But there's some hard work involved in making sure that we get the buyers out to look at it and then we get bids on the day of the bid opening. So the forester is going to create those sale documents. Now, I use the prospectus that I just showed you in the previous slide, but I delete the value columns. So what we're presenting to the logger is the information of the number of trees, the volume, important information like volume per tree, and the percentage. But we're going to let them make their own value calculations. We're also going to include maps, and then out on the site we're actually going to put out some signs and make it as easy as possible for those potential bidders to come out and look at that timber. We're also going to draw up a timber sale contract. Okay, timber sale contract says that we expect to sell the timber for a set price to be determined after the bid opening, but we also expect certain conditions to be met as part of that arrangement. So we want to be concerned about how the roads are left. We want to make sure that the operator only operates on your property, and we're going to go into some details as to what can be cut and what is not cut in the sale. And the forester is now going to contact buyers, and he's going to show the timber. And you know, at this point in time, what he does is he becomes the salesman and represents the landowner in the sale of that timber. Now, in the timber sale diagram, the flow chart that you have either in your booklet or available for download, we have outlined what we call a bid sale. Let me just go into a little bit of detail about what a bid sale is. A bid sale means that we've collected the information, we've done our inventory, we've put together a timber prospectus, we've gone out and marked the trees, identified them for sale, we've set up our signs, and we've provided some maps, and we're going to allow the prospective buyers to go out and take a look at that timber and decide what they think it's worth. We have a form, a sealed bid form, in which they'll fill out before a predetermined date and time. I like to do it on Friday afternoons at 12 noon. And what we do is all the potential bidders have to submit their bid on the form before the specified bid opening time. A lot of times I do it in my office, and we have the landowners present, but not all the time. And so what we're going to do at Friday at noon is we're going to open the bids. And if we get 5 or 6 bids, we'll be happy. And we'll open those bids and we'll set them on the desk in order from high to low. Now, hopefully, just as we had talked about in the early sessions and when we had our timber prospectus in front of us with that timber value, we're going to talk to the landowner and say, hey, if we look at these bids, we notice that we have one bid that meets or exceeds the appraised value. And at that point in time, as a forester representing that landowner, I'm saying that it's my advice that we go ahead and make this timber sale, and we feel comfortable with the bidder because, of course, we pre-screened everybody in advance of the bid opening. So there we are. We've got a bid, and it meets or exceeds that appraised value. We always allow the landowners the right to reject any and all bids in the process. But again, we've had the conversation in advance. We know what the timber is worth in an approximate appraisal. And if we meet or exceed that appraised value, we expect to move forward with the timber sale. Now there's another style, and we probably, as a firm, as a consulting firm, we sell as much timber in a negotiated sale system as we do on bid sales. And a negotiated sale is very similar to the bid sale. We've gone out and we've identified the trees for sale. We've made our measurements. We've got an appraisal. We feel comfortable. We know exactly what that timber is worth. But in this circumstance, what we're going to do, the forester is going to approach a particular timber buyer, and he's going to present him the volume information only. Well, again, we retain that value information for our purposes. And he negotiates the best price and, this is important, the proper sale conditions. So sometimes a negotiated sale suits the landowner because maybe he wants to work with a particular logger. Maybe he has good luck with them in the past, or maybe he's heard good things. But what we want to do is we just want to make sure that he's going to offer a price, or we're going to sell the timber at a price that meets or exceeds that appraised value. So in this particular situation, we may save 3 to 4 weeks, because in the bid sale process, it takes some time to put together that sale and show the timber and then have the bid opening. With a negotiated sale, we can save some time. And if you're the landowner and you're paying the consultant's fee, that saved time also saves you some fees, management fees. So we normally do a negotiated sale for less money than what it costs us to put together a bid sale. And your consulting forester should help you with that decision. What makes the most sense for your particular set of circumstances? In some cases, a bid sale may be the best way to go. In other cases, a negotiated sale is the best way to go. More than one way to do this. But what's important, in all cases, we're going to use a timber sale contract. So, we've got a buyer, we've set the price, and we're going to move forward with the sale by executing a contract. Now, what happens is the buyer, the timber buyer, and the seller, you, the landowner, and myself are all going to meet at what we call the closing. Okay? And at that closing, we're going to sign the timber sale contract. You're going to receive payment for the timber. We're going to collect any of the necessary insurance documents. That can include general liability, workers' comp insurance. And we're going to collect a damage deposit. That damage deposit is important because what we want to do is have some money, and we're going to set it aside in an escrow account. And we're going to use that money as leverage to ensure that we get our contract. Remember our contract up here. We want to make sure that the terms of that agreement, that our contractor meets the terms of that contract, and once we're happy with the harvest of the timber and the retirement of the roads, we feel as though everything's best left in good shape. We can go ahead and return that escrow money, but this damage deposit gives us the leverage we need just to make sure everything goes as it should. Now, the final process, we've sold the timber, we've got the money, and now it's time for the harvester to go in there and cut the timber. Well, your consulting forester can provide oversight of the timber sale. We need to ensure that we have BMP compliance, and BMP is defined as best management practices for timber harvesting. Now, this is important. The Forest Conservation Act, the state of Kentucky has a Forest Conservation Act that ensures that when timber harvesting takes place, there are certain practices that ensure that we don't lose soil to erosion, and that soil doesn't end up in streams, cause siltation and what we call non-point sources of pollution. Those best management practices are taught to our master loggers through continuing education and other programs. And as a as the forester in charge of the sale, we want to make sure, we want to look over the shoulder of the operator to make sure he knows what he's doing and that everything is done properly. So those best management practices, that's important that we do this correctly, and that's what the forester is going to help to make sure. Of course, our contract is going to go beyond just what the BMPs are. We're going to have information in there concerning where the logs are going to be loaded. Perhaps there needs to be some gravel put on a road after the harvest is complete. Whatever the specific terms of the contract are, we want to make sure that that's done in a timely fashion. And then when everything is done to our satisfaction, we can close the sale and we can return the escrow money. So at this point, we've had a successful timber sale, and we've had control over the whole process, and so we can feel good about that. Now, whether you use a consulting forester or you decide to sell timber on your own, you need to know a little bit about how timber is valued. And I'm going to just go over a few points to explain how timber is valued and why, often I have a landowner have a successful timber sale, and then I get a call from their neighbor, and they want to know, my forest is growing right next to Farmer Jones, and he got all that money for his timber, but now you tell me mine is not worth as much. Well, there are differences, and we're going to touch on those differences to find out, why different stands in different parts of the state are worth different amounts. We're going to start the discussion with stumpage values. So this is important, and sometimes it's confusing for landowners, but we're going to talk about stumpage values. The values that I presented in the prospectus, in that report, that sample report, are stumpage values. We're going to go into a little bit of detail about what stumpage values are. We're going to talk about timber characteristics. So we're going to talk about how one stand can be different from the other depending on what the species composition is, the terrain, and how big the timber is. We're going to talk a little bit about distance to mill and competition, probably the number one factor in determining how successful we're going to be in a timber sale. Okay, let's start with stumpage values. I like to say that stumpage values are the value of the trees standing in the woods. Right here is a very simple equation. Stumpage values. Stumpage values, or the value of those trees in the woods, are influenced by what local mills are paying for logs delivered to their mill, and what also influences stumpage value is going to be the cost of logging. That's the cost of logging, and remember, these guys are in business to make some money, so that cost of logging is going to include a fair profit in there as well. So stumpage values for your area are going to be determined by what mill values are and what logging costs are. Ultimately, those things are going to determine what standing timber is worth in your area. Now, we're going to refer to something called a lump sum. A lump sum sale is defined as a sale in which all timber is paid for in advance of cutting the timber. Well, you may ask, how do you know what the timber is worth until you cut it? Well, remember, we have a consulting forester that can go out and give us a measurement of that timber in advance, and he has the expertise and knowledge to put a value on that timber. So, if we want to have complete financial control in the transaction, what we want to do is we want to get an appraised price in advance of cutting that timber, and we want to sell it for a lump sum amount. A lump sum sale is going to give you the greatest amount of financial control in the transaction. Remember, we measured the timber when the trees are standing, and with this volume, we determined the stumpage value, or we negotiated the sale price. Again, another way of looking at stumpage value is saying what the value of the trees are standing in the woods. Now, a more traditional, maybe more common way of selling timber throughout Kentucky is what we call cutting on shares. Now, cutting on shares can be defined as that once the logs are cut, delivered to the mill, and the mill determines the value and writes the checks, the value is split between the logger and the landowner. Okay? Very often this is done on a 50-50 split, but one of the things you have to be aware of is that share cutting leaves you little control in the transaction, at least financial control. So we hope that everybody's honest and that we get a full accounting of where all the logs are delivered, but we really don't have too much control over that. And so once something happens and there's a dispute, there's really no way to go back and try to fix that. So if we negotiate the price in advance of the cutting of the timber, we're in a much better shape financially. Something to consider. You may have increased liability because you own the logs as they're delivered to the mill. Remember, when you sell the timber standing, your liability stops once those trees are cut, and so we're actually taking on a little more liability when we follow those logs all the way to the delivered mill. And I'll just say that the tax calculations on a lump sum sale are very straightforward when compared to cutting on shares. When cutting on shares, you may jeopardize your capital gains treatment. Something to be aware of. I just briefly want to outline that those timber characteristics, those things that determine what timber is worth, can be based on species and product. Currently, in the state of Kentucky, we have a very healthy bourbon industry, which requires a lot of barrels. Those barrels are made out of high-quality white oak logs. So, currently, white oak is a very valuable species to us, and that can, if you have a high amount of white oak in your stand, that can translate to very good or very high stumpage values. Remember, the distance to the mill is going to affect your stumpage value. Okay? The farther you are from a mill or available markets, the higher the cost of production is going to be, and the lower the stumpage value. Competition. The number of mills competing for wood in your area is going to influence stumpage values. And remember, it's a balancing act. Okay? It's a balancing act in a competitive marketplace. So, that when logs are plentiful and timber is plentiful, prices can go down. When the markets are good and demand is strong, prices can come up. And we don't have control over the price. We're gonna have to react to the conditions in the market. And then we also want to be aware that buyers may be willing to negotiate, but the log value at the mill is going to influence what they can pay. For the most part, the wood products made from standing timber and logs, those products are commodities. So we are a little bit limited on how high of a price we can get. Now I would like to wrap things up with a few observations that I've made over the years, and I think if you take away something from this presentation tonight, it's this. You want to avoid certain circumstances when planning your timber sale. Don't get into a rush. Your timber has been growing for 70 to 80 years. Now, you may not have owned it for that period of time, but you got to remember that this is there's a long life to this product, and it takes a long time for it to mature. There's no sense in rushing into a timber sale. Generally, timber is growing and improving over time, so don't get into a rush. Do your homework and be aware of what the markets are and seek out some professional advice. Don't allow the timber buyer to manage your sale. We went over some really good tips on how you can take control of your sale, and that's important. And don't ignore proper forest management. Read that sheet, the article on big trees, little trees, and learn all that you can about how the forest grows and develops, because that's going to lead to sustainable management and good decisions down the line. Well, that's the end of my presentation, but I would like to take this time and answer any questions any of you may have out in the audience.
Okay, folks, so please use the chat pod in the left-hand corner there to put any questions for Chris. Chris, thank you so much. I really enjoyed your presentation. You know, it's so important for landowners to hear this information. Hopefully they're hearing it before the sale, and it's just very valuable information. You know, it's hard for landowners to really get a lot of expertise in selling timber because they don't really get that much experience compared to like some of our cattlemen or other grain producers. So
That's right. You know, in this situation where you may only sell timber once or twice, you may never really develop the expertise that you need to have a successful timber sale. So, you know, each of the consulting foresters listed in the KACF brochure are independent businessmen. They set their own prices. So, talk to those individuals and see if you feel comfortable with them and their prices. And you might be pleasantly surprised at the end of your timber sale. I think you'll get more money than what you might without their expertise.
Sure. Looks like we had a few questions come in here.
The first one from Michael Mullins is the question is the forester paid on a percentage? Well, again, you know, each individual consulting forester is going to determine their own rates. So compare those rates. And ask them questions about how it's done. We very often do it, my firm often does it as a percentage of the timber sale. And some people find that's a convenient way to do it. Any rules of thumb when determining logging costs? That's a great question.
We have a little diversity in terrain here in Kentucky for sure.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So I'm going to tell you the number one factor that affects timber values is terrain. So when we're in the eastern part of the state, we've got some rugged mountains, and road building is important and expensive. So the cost of logging in eastern Kentucky is much higher than it is in central Kentucky and western Kentucky. So you can imagine the change in terrain as we go from east to west.
Certainly.
There's going to be a difference. I'll tell you what, if it would be always a good idea to talk to a local consulting forester in your area, and they can give you a pretty good idea what logging costs are in your area. On your timber, getting too large before the sale. Oh, can your timber get too large before the sale? It's possible, but it doesn't happen too often. I think the biggest concern there is if your timber becomes too old, sometimes you have health disease issues. So my recommendation is a forest management plan.
Certainly.
You can address many of those concerns in advance. Now, big timber generally sells well, but it's quality that's going to make the difference on some of those big trees. How much does a consulting forester charge to manage a sale? Well, this is a good question, Billy, and obviously you want to take that into consideration, right? Because that management cost comes out of your sale revenues. So I'll say this, that again, we don't in any way, want to set prices, but I think it's best if you address those concerns with one of the consulting foresters in the KACF brochure. Feel free to give them a call and talk to them about their specific services that they provide and what they charge for those services. Where can I get a report of prices mills are paying? Okay, this is a good question.
Real good question.
So, again, there's mill prices,
Right.
and we talked about stumpage values. So, mill prices are actually, there's a report that the UK's...
Or actually, Kentucky Division of Forestry.
The Kentucky Division of Forestry, along with, I think, on the UK Ag website, maybe?
Oh, yeah, and Growing Gold.
And Growing Gold.
Is
so
that
there's
website.
Yeah, so there's a few resources out there, and we could probably make some of those links available over time.
Yep.
There are some resources available to figure out what current prices are for logs being delivered to the sawmill. Okay, so now you know that those prices are different from stumpage values.
Sure.
So there's got to be a little bit of a calculation done to bring it back to stumpage values. Sometimes interpretation of these numbers, you may need the assistance of somebody in the business. But again, you can talk to your local consulting forester, and he should be able to talk intelligently about what delivered log prices are to the mill and how that affects your stumpage values.
Good. So we certainly encourage folks to take advantage of that expertise that's out there. If you don't know how to go about the timber sale, it's not something you want to go in blind or not know much about. So reach out to the help that's available for sure. And Chris, you talked about another thing I thought was really important about the importance of management. We think about a timber harvest sometimes as an isolated event, but really that's one of the few times where we have a lot of activity, a lot of stuff going on the ground. That it seems like we could have a really positive impact on that future forest.
Yes, we can have a positive impact, or we can have a really big negative impact on that forest as well. So a little bit of time, effort, and expense up front can save you a whole lot of hardship and disappointment after a timber sale. So it is the number one thing that's going to impact our management of that forest land. And as stewards of the forest, we want to try to do everything that we can to have a positive outcome.
Yeah, we want future generations to have the same opportunities that we do. So,
it's a great resource. It's a great industry to be involved in because it's a renewable resource, and it provides great wildlife habitat, water resources, clean air as it's building that wood product. So it's a neat thing to be involved with.
No doubt. Okay, folks, we'll take some more questions if we do have any. Again, in the upper left corner of the screen, there are those different files we talked about that you can download. And we got the web links. We'll be pulling those back up in just a second here for you. Renee's found us the Growing Gold. Thank you, Renee. You can see that address up there at the top, but it's through the Kentucky Division of Forestry, and just search for Growing Gold and you'll find it. So, Renee, if you don't mind, you can scroll down through this a little bit, get all the way down to the last few pages if you can.
Yeah, typically it's on the last page or two is the price report.
No, if I can I navigate that? Let me see it.
Looks like we can.
Yeah, it looks like you're letting me navigate. Okay, so I'll get to it real quick.
That may be the back page. Oh, there we go.
Wait.
We're close.
We're close.
There we go.
Okay, so this is the Kentucky delivered log prices. This looks like the fourth quarter from 2014, but it does, it has some of those species like you were showing there and some of their prices as well. We see here, Chris, they break it down by grades as well, different grades. So.
And regions as well. So, what we were talking about, Billy, about the changes in terrain, they have a map that corresponds to region 1, 2, and 3.
All right, I'll see if I can pull that up right here. I think it's coming up. Hopefully, so there's the different regions of the state. So
sure, and that tracks closely to log costs, or logging costs, So so you can review that information again. Remember, that's the value or the price paid delivered to the mill, and you'll see that there's ranges on there.
Right.
So the more competition you have in the area,
Certainly.
the closer they'll be to the higher end of those ranges.
No doubt.
Where there's less competition, they'll probably be on the lower end of that.
Okay. All right. Let's see if we got any more questions coming in. Okay. Sorry, guys, if you couldn't see that page. It is the Growing Gold, so if you search for the Kentucky Division of Forestry and Growing Gold, you should be able to find it there. Let's see. Any other questions coming in?
Looks like there's a question coming up.
And I would say, if you all do have other questions or you need more links for some of this stuff, feel free to give us an email. I'll put our email in the pod here that you can send us emails to, and we'll make sure you get a response.
Also, Billy, it looks like Renee has the link for Growing Gold up in the in the web link.
Okay, great. Thank you, Renee. Appreciate that. So up there in the upper left-hand corner, you can see that link as well. And I think you can actually get on that mailing list if you want. There's an opportunity for folks. I think they can get on that mailing list.
But it is available. Yeah,
it's available online though as well. So,
it is. It is.
Let me see here. All right, so folks, take advantage of the opportunity we've got right now with having Chris. If you got any other questions, we certainly want to get them across to you.
Well, Billy, we touched on it a little bit, but the management plan is the key to setting up a timber sale.
Right.
And so when a management plan is written, there's a lot of information that's collected.
Right.
And that helps a forester transition from early discussions of a timber sale and move you quickly, more quickly, to the actual timber sale itself.
Oh, certainly. That management plan is important for so many reasons. Certainly, if you're participating in some of the cost share programs that are available through the federal government, those all require a management plan. And just knowing what you have through that plan is just a valuable asset to have.
Well, it sure is. And it can help identify any potential health issues that you may have, invasive species, insect outbreaks. So the management plan is the key to it, and we've got some great resources out there. NRCS is a great resource and can help a landowner pay for either the whole cost or a majority of the cost of that management plan.
Yeah, certainly.
So no reason not to have one.
No, if you can't get it there or through the Kentucky Division of Forestry or a consultant forester, a lot of folks out there that can develop those plans for you.
That's correct.
Yeah. So take advantage of that. Let's see.
Do you want to address time of year to harvest, the issues involved?
So does it matter when we harvest? What time of year? Is there a better time of year to harvest?
Sure. We ideally we'd like to operate only during the driest months of the year.
But
we don't always know when those driest months are going to be. So we're confronted with a variety of different environmental conditions throughout the year. The nice thing is that we have strong markets, and there's buyers in the market for just about every month of the year. So we can sell timber. And then to reflect on Doug's question, when do we want to harvest it? I think good supervision, a good plan, layout of roads, proper location of landing, all those things can help minimize the disturbances made during poor weather conditions. And we work with very good contractors. If the weather conditions are poor, they're not gonna start operating during bad weather. So I think the response to that is maybe not a time of year, but a proper attitude toward timber harvesting is what's important.
All right. Good advice.
Oh, Renee has reminded us about the Kentucky Woodland Owners Association.
Oh, sure. Yep.
A great, Kentucky's very fortunate. There's a volunteer organization called the Kentucky Woodland Owners Association. You can find out more about what that organization is about by going to the link.
Yeah, and I think I could just type that in right here for them.
Yeah, it's pretty simple. It's www.kwoa.org. .net.
Yeah. And I've had the pleasure of working with that group for more than a decade. And folks, if you're not a member of the Kentucky Woodland Owners Association and you are a landowner, I strongly encourage you to do so. They work a lot on the behalf of landowners here in the state of Kentucky, whether you realize it or not. So they could certainly use your support.
What's very important about the organization is that you'll learn from your peers as well. Billy, there's landowners that have gone through timber harvests, other types of forest management practices that can share their experiences with you. And it's nice to get a consulting forester up here to talk to you, but I think it means a little bit more sometimes when you get a good story or good feedback from one of your peers, another landowner.
Yeah, no doubt. Sometimes they can relate a lot better than maybe some of us can. So
absolutely.
And those links up there, Renee pulled up the web links again in the upper left-hand corner. You can click on any of those and then browse directly to those in your browser. All right. Well, folks, if there's no more questions, we'll hang for just another second. But I'll take this opportunity to thank you again, Chris. I mean, really appreciate you coming all the way from Danville, being a part of the program. We've got you spread out across Kentucky tonight for a lot of great landowners. And I would like to thank our county extension agents as well for opening up their offices and serving as hosts. We really appreciate that. And for you folks at home, thanks for joining us and being a part of this show. And Chris, again, thank you so much for a great presentation and hopefully giving folks a lot of good information that'll make a big difference in their lives.
Well, thank you. On behalf of the Kentucky Association of Consulting Foresters, we appreciate this opportunity to reach out to landowners. Yeah. So thanks. We appreciate it.
All right. And Renee, thanks for all you do behind the scenes. We appreciate it. All right. So, folks, that's all we've got for tonight. I will tell you on December 1st, we have our next webinar in the series. We're going to be talking about wildfire, and that's certainly an issue of concern here in the state of Kentucky as well. We have Mr. Floyd Willis. Floyd is the Fire Management Chief for the Kentucky Division of Forestry, and he's going to be giving a presentation about the impact of wildfire on your woods and some of the things you can do to make sure that your homes are safe in wildfire-prone areas. So, tune in again with us on December 1st, and we'll be glad to have you with us then. And thanks again for being with us tonight.